Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Climate Conundrum podcast. We try to demystify complex climate issues here. I'm your host, Sanika Diwanji, and I'm a communications expert in the realm of climate change. And today we're going to dive into a scorching topic that's gripping the world with each passing year. Don't mind my pun here, but it's about heat waves. Um, it's early March when we're recording this, and it's already pretty warm. Warm is an understatement. It's summer's full swing here. So yeah, as we crank up the air conditioning and seek shade during these blistering days, I think it's crucial to sort of understand the deeper connections between climate change and the rising temperatures we experience. So yeah, to make sense of this particular climate conundrum, I'm very happy to have someone with the exact expertise required to help us navigate the science, the policy, and the real world impact of heat waves. Um, Happy to introduce you to Aditya Pillai. Hi, Aditya. I'm happy to
Hi,
have you here. Um, a quick
thanks for
introduction
having me.
on what he does. He conducts research on climate adaptation with a focus on strengthening policies to combat extreme heat. He also studies the forms and varieties of national climate institutions and how India should restructure its institutions to achieve mitigation and adaptation objectives. So, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about this and to engage with the audience, and hopefully we can demystify heat.
Yes, definitely a need of the hour, especially considering we are expecting a long and pretty hot summer. Every year we keep
Yeah,
breaking records, not just in India, but across the world. So I thought it's important to understand what exactly is happening on that front. Uh,
absolutely.
Yeah, so heat waves are not just a one-off issue, right? They're becoming increasingly frequent and also intense each year. Like every year, we see headlines saying February was the hottest month in the recorded history of climate data and stuff. So I think I want to start with the basic question itself for someone who might be completely unfamiliar with the term. We hear it so much, heat waves, but what does it really mean? What is it, and how does it even differ from, say, just hot weather?
Right. That is a very good question. It's also, I think, a somewhat technical question because heat waves are administratively decided, right? It is a point at which a government or a Met department decides that the heat has gotten so bad that it might surpass the coping capacity of the community to deal with it,
Mm.
right? So normally the way it works is the public health specialists who sit down and gather data about how many people die every day, and they look at it over time, and they match it with temperature data or other types of hazard data, and they figure out that at a particular temperature, the number of heat deaths spikes. And that then becomes the temperature at which they say a heat wave is declared, because that's the best possible estimate you can get of when heat is gotten so bad that people aren't able to cope with it. And this obviously varies a lot because it's not just about how the human body reacts to heat, but it's also about things as subtle or unknowable as how communities interact with each other. So there's this great book, totally worth reading if your listeners want to get into heat. But there's this book by Eric Kleinenberg about the Chicago heat wave in the early 90s called The Social Autopsy of a Disaster. And the really interesting and counterintuitive finding is was that a lot of deaths in that heat wave came because there was a lack of community structures, right?
Ah,
And people weren't looking out for each other in the same way they were looking out for each other in other neighborhoods where heat deaths were less. And so it's something as subtle as the way people relate to each other, but it's also about things that have to do with the formal economy, right? So attributes such as, where do your people work? Are they working in occupations that are heat exposed? Or do you, for various reasons, have a large vulnerable population, like a lot of old people, which many states in India are now approaching that point of having a much higher percentage of old people than they've had previously. Places like Kerala, for example, and I think the national average over the next 30, 40 years will start moving in that direction, right? As the fertility rate comes down. So these are all considerations that then go into when you declare a heat wave and when you figure out what needs to be done and when it needs to be done. So it's a bit of a technical answer, but I do want to draw your listeners' attention to the distinction between a heat wave and extreme heat, right? So these two things are of a variety, because heat waves are sort of the technical temperature measure, but extreme heat is something that affects everybody all the time, right? It is also dangerous. So if a heat wave is being declared at 42 degrees, 41 degrees can still be dangerous to a lot of people. And since that's an administrative decision, it doesn't apply to everyone in the same way. So as the planet gets hotter, I think heat is a threat across the board and at different levels based on who you are and what you do. And it could zap your productivity, it could affect your kids going to school. So it's not just about heat waves. I think heat waves are a governmental way of trying to institute emergency measures and so on. But the broader threat is very real, regardless of whether a heat wave has been declared or not. And maybe not as much now, but say in the next 10 to 15 years, once we pass the 1.5-degree warming mark, hit 2, for example, these things are all going to be very intense and will have to be focused on.
Absolutely. No, what I hear from you is that while it's a technical issue, it's also a very sociological one, because it does
Yes.
affect people equally. I think who you are, where you stay, how you do you have the economic means to cope with it will matter a lot. I think on that note, along with heat wave, there's another technical term that at least I see a lot in news lately, which is the wet bulb effect. And I want to address that because what you said earlier, right? The temperature itself can be probably not so much on the thermometer, but it can affect
Yes.
you at a very dangerous level.
Yeah.
Could you probably help us understand what that is?
Absolutely, yeah. So the wet bulb temperature is basically when you factor humidity into the raw sort of temperature that you have, right? And because where humidity is very high, people have a much harder time discarding the heat that's trapped in their body, because sweat is the mechanism that is used to do that, and evaporation sweat particularly. And if you're not able in those conditions of high humidity to sort of dispel that heat, the body can't cool down, and so it basically bakes on the inside because it's too high. I mean, the human body is a highly thermoregulated environment, right? And any sort of change, either up or down, is a threat, and it's a threat if it persists for a long period, and that's why it's worrying. So in places where it's close to full humidity, in the high 30s, you end up having conditions where humans aren't able to cool down unless they're put in an artificially cooled place. And that
A classic example of this.
sorry,
Mumbai would be a
what?
classic example of this.
Yeah, anything down the coast, for example, or anything, any place that's near a very large water body, or for any other reason, has high levels of humidity or can have humidity spikes. So if you're out there working and you're exerting yourself, and you're unable to sweat your way through it, you could very quickly end up in a situation where your body isn't able to cope with it, and then you show signs of heat stress, and eventually possibly a heat stroke or worse. This is the sort of problem that worries people a lot when it comes to these mass death events, because there are different impacts that heat can have. If you look at it from the way an economist would look at it, you'd start thinking about productivity losses, right? I'm not able to work as much as I otherwise might have been able to. And that means less income, which means less expenditure, which means less consumption across the economy. And then that has all sorts of knock-on effects. And also businesses don't do very well. And so you have all this instability in the system. And that's just one aspect of it. But the real lurking danger, apart from this, is the fact that you could have deaths in the many thousands, right? And I'm sure some of your listeners have read Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Ministry of the Future, which opens with this horrifying scene of a mass heat wave death event in Uttar Pradesh. And I think that really sort of focused people's minds on the idea of what humidity can do in the context of heat, right? So there are parallels in science fiction that hopefully will never come to pass, but it is definitely a major threat.
Yeah, we're inching close to that though.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with that in mind, right, with different states having to face different kinds of heat as well, I'm also wondering, like, one question that keeps popping up is, how has heat changed across the Indian subcontinent, for example? In your research, how would you say the data shows that this has changed? What role does climate change even play in this? Because a lot of people can argue that, well, yeah, it's just a hot summer and it's not being so bad. The Earth manages to do its own thing. So do you see a proper change in temperatures over years?
Yeah, so thankfully we have at this point enough evidence to show that heat waves are increasing in duration and in frequency. And this is a heat wave standard set according to the national standard in that particular paper by M. Rajivan and co. Who's a former head of Secretary of the Ministry of Earth Sciences. And this paper basically has an all-India plot of temperature changes between 1960 and I want to say 2020 or 2021. And it's pretty stark because it's pan-India, firstly, right? You can see like the spikes in heat waves across the country, and the duration is increasing in a whole lot of places, especially the northern plains, but also across the country. There are places that previously did not have heat as a threat now coming online and having to deal with this problem and seeing more heat waves. So there's a spread, there's intensity, there's frequency. So all of these things are happening, and this is just purely historical data. And then the question is, what does this mean for the future, right? This is going to keep continuing in this vein for the coming few decades. And so there are, again, several studies that project into the future based on climate models. And so these are very sophisticated models that climatologists have that plug in a whole bunch of variables about how much carbon's going into the atmosphere and how much is being withdrawn by forests and so on. And then they estimate how much heat will increase, how much the temperature increases. And then that allows them to predict what temperatures are going to look like compared to our present levels and compared to the pre-industrial average, which is usually the benchmark. And I think what we're seeing across several papers now is, firstly, there are going to be large parts of the country, especially the sort of Indo-Gangetic plain, everything from Rajasthan all the way to West Bengal, that gets extremely, extremely hot and has a much higher probability of heat waves. And you're going to see patches of the rest of the country really look pretty deep red in terms of their probability of heat waves. And we have some estimations now of what that might look like in terms of mortality, though these are very imprecise at the moment. But I think it's safe to say that there is a distinct possibility that mortalities will go up. So that is, the number of deaths will go up. And we have some studies on what it'll do to productivity, and the number of minutes an hour a person can work before they have to retreat into some sort of cooler place to sort of recover. And then so people sort of take that number and extrapolate it across the economy. And it's quite clear that there will be significant job losses. And there's this one sort of conservative pathway plotted out in a report by the International Labour Organization for India. And by 2030, they claim as many as the equivalent of 34 million jobs might be lost. And that is not 34 million people, but it is the productivity of 34 million people averaged out across the economy, which is still a lot, right? Mm-hmm. That is the size of a European country, just not producing output, which is a pretty big deal, whichever way you look at it, whether it's about how people are able to survive this sort of thing with reduced incomes, or what it means for their health and what it means for the next generation. So all of these things then start coming into play. So the fingerprint of climate change is actually, I think, at this point with the heat wave problem, with extreme heat, is fairly incontrovertible. I think there's enough evidence to suggest that this is a problem and it is going to grow. And I don't think I've seen anything actually to the contrary so far.
Wow, that is pretty alarming. And with so much of not just economy, but even lives at stake, the obvious question that comes to mind is what is the government doing? Like, do we have a plan in place? Do we have a priority policy? How do governments deal with this?
Yeah, that's a very good and very tricky question, because tricky in the sense the solution is not straightforward, right? I think one of the things that's sort of very important to understand about heat as a problem is that it varies a lot locally, right? And if you stitch together a lot of the things we've been chatting about for the last couple of minutes, in terms of, say, humidity being a factor, or where vulnerable populations are, what your vulnerabilities are, what
I have a cat and she's very curious to come see what's up.
Very curious about the heat. I'm sure she doesn't enjoy it very much either in peak summers. And indeed, yeah, things like, does the district have a high exposure to risk to animal husbandry, which is actually a very big problem. Because, you have a bunch of cattle dying, then that's the main sort of productive capital asset that most people have. And heat waves do this, right? It's an equal opportunity offender. Anyone or anything that's exposed gets knocked out, which again contributes to economic story. So it's a deeply localized phenomenon in that sense, which means every place needs to do its own thing in terms of dealing with it. And you can't have a one size fits all. This isn't like, say, this isn't like monetary policy where you can have a national lever that you pull, and that has all sorts of effects, but it's more or less predictable what it's going to do in different places. This doesn't work that way because the problem's actually very different in different places and cannot be aggregated, right? When we talk about average heating numbers, when we say, oh yeah, the planet is warmed by 1.1 degrees, that does not mean every single place is warmed by 1.1 degrees. Right? Some places are much, much warmer and some places aren't as warm. And so that's the tyranny of an average, the cognitive tyranny of an average, is you start thinking of things in a certain way. But each place has to deal with a different thing. And so the one thing people in this space like to talk about, especially architects and urban planners, is something called the urban heat island effect, right? So listeners of yours in cities, I think, would have noticed at different points that whenever they come into a very dense built-up area, it actually is quite hot. But then if you're in a part of town that has a lot of trees and gardens and maybe even a forest, the temperature drops immediately, right? So that's basically the effect. So you have to plug in all of these things when you're planning. And obviously at higher levels of government, it's much harder to factor in that kind of nuance in a plan. So basically what we're left with is the need for highly localized plans that can be implemented. Right. And that then puts a spotlight on the capacity of local governments across the country to A, understand heat as a problem. What can it do? What is it? Why should I care? Why is it just not a regular summer problem? B, implementing things, but it's not just about, say, increasing your ambulance capacity or making sure your hospitals are able to handle heat stroke cases. It is about sort of covering multiple sectors of the economy simultaneously, right? So we were just talking about animals and cattle and animal husbandry. Equally, farms are a threat. Your construction sector, a whole bunch of informal sector workers, so women working in a MSME type situation, producing things indoor, think about brick kilns. So in an average district, you have a bunch of things that could well be a threat to your heat resilience. So you have to think about all of these things, figure out ways of implementing solutions across these sectors, and then think about ways of refining your planning and implementation, right? And that I'll say is very important because these things aren't static, because the heat threat itself is changing. It is not the same. And social structures are changing. So vulnerability is changing. So there are a number of variables in this mix that are changing all the time. So it is very complex, and you're preparing for a much worse future in terms of the level of heat. So you have to figure out a strategy as the head of local government or as the council that has been tasked with this, that works for you. So that's where it gets very tricky, because different places, so a Bombay, for example, or a Bangalore Municipal Corporation or Ahmedabad has monies and powers and capacity that it can draw on, has exposure to the outside world, access to research and so on, that a district in some other place, Madhya Pradesh or Uttar Pradesh or Andhra, may not have, right? And so it is that sort of capacity gap that really needs to be bridged very, very quickly. Because one of the tricky things about this is, if you want to have measures that work, you have to be thinking long term, right? There's only so much sort of emergency knee-jerk response you can do. And after a certain point, it's not going to be enough, because you're just going to have systems that are overwhelmed. So then you have to think about preparing for things and preventing the worst effects from kicking in. So what that means is you have to rethink how you design buildings. So you have to think about, sorry?
You mentioned earlier the urban planning part would come.
Urban planning, absolutely. Right. So the structure of your buildings, and whether it's a glass fronted building, and there's sort of this convergence in modern design across tier 2, tier 3 cities in this country. They all sort of, like, it is aspirational, and the way the newest buildings look, it's always the same. It's sort of this heat trapping, it's air conditioning, so on and so forth. And so things like that have to change. The way you structure your cities itself, right? How much green space do you have? How much density do you permit? And in places that are already dense, how do you handle that from an urban planning perspective? How do you line your trees? How do you line your canopies with, how do you line your streets with canopies that prevent heat from getting through? These are things that take 15, 20 years. You're building bylaws and urban greening and so on and so forth, right? The worry there is, if you don't have the ability to start right away, then it becomes extremely, extremely difficult to catch up later on. So you need action now, preparing for a future And that future is, say, 20 years down the line, going to get very, very intensely hot. So you need that amount of foresight and capability to predict and to make these big changes that are politically difficult, that require restructuring parts of cities and, changing building codes, investing huge amounts in research, for example, to understand how things are working and whether things are working, because heat is this frontier issue, right? We know very, very little at this point about how to deal with this problem effectively. So we have a whole range of solutions. And there are many dozens of solutions knocking about the Indian heat policy ecosystem, but very few of them have been truly tested for Indian heat conditions, right? So these are kind of like first principles. It makes sense to do this, this, and this. But how does it actually interact when the rubber hits the road and when you're actually looking at people implementing this on the ground? What do those solutions look like? Are they actually leading to reduced temperatures? So, for example, there's a lot of talk about cool roofs. And there's a little bit of research coming out suggesting that cool roofs do work well, but in some contexts, in other contexts, they don't have as much of an effect. So these are the kinds of things you have to invest in long term to understand exactly what you need to be doing. And that presents a major challenge, especially when you go down all the way to the third tier of government.
So this is where I keep coming back. Whatever I'm hearing you explain, I think it's scaring me to think that this is such a large scale issue, and at the same time, maybe we don't have the structures in place to have a policy that might be sort of universally adapted. But then who is responsible? Is it the state government? Is it the district administrators? What is India's stance on the policy front right now?
It is an interesting question, right? I think a lot of the heat action plans that are currently floating around do not have any sort of legal grounding. So districts and cities.
So before I think I'm just gonna take that moment to ask you what a heat action plan is, because I wanted to come to that next,
Right.
but absolutely crucial to understand what that even means.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very simply the document that summarizes a lot of things that we were just talking about, right? It gives governments a standard operating procedure of what to do when a heat wave is declared. It tells them how to declare a heat wave, so the particular temperature at which it should be declared, the kind of solutions that go into different sectoral responses, and a bunch of institutional things about how and when the heat action plan should be refined and so on, right?
So already in place, we already have this at a national level, or is this still being formed?
No, so this usually happens at as local a level as possible. So it happens at the level of districts, where districts have heat action plans, cities have heat action plans, some states have heat action plans. We don't have a national heat.
We have some states have it, not all so far.
Most states have it. Yeah, most states have it. It's pretty common. I think I'd hazard like 80% of all states have it at this point. So it's a pretty high number at the state level. It actually gets less, I think, at the district and city level. So there are fewer districts and cities, which is a bit of a problem because you are, like I say, you need this to be as localized as possible. And if it isn't localized, it's less effective, right? There is no national heat action plan, which is probably a good thing because you cannot prescribe one national standard.
Right.
Exactly. So that's what a heat action plan is. The key thing about these heat action plans is they don't have a very firm regulatory structure. So it's not entirely clear where they draw their power from, right? So it's a standard operating procedure, so which is good to have. So everyone kind of knows, each department in government and all the major institutions like hospitals know what the plan is. But in terms of levels of enforceability and accountability, it's a problem when you don't have legal grounding for something. And so I think it is a question for the next generation of heat action plans, as plans that exist are refined and new plans come online. It is a question about where we ground this legally. Is this grounded in disaster management acts, which are fairly powerful legal instruments? or are there standalone laws that are created which may or may not be the best way of handling this? So there are those sorts of questions that are quite important. So that would then answer your question of who is responsible for this, because you actually have to have some sort of legal structure, and that is something that is being sorted out, should be sorted out very, very quickly. I'm not sure how much it is being sorted out, but it should be. The second part of it is, it's also one of those. So to my mind, at least, it's the level of government that is implementing the heat action plan, right?
Mhm.
So if it's the district, then it's district's responsibility. If it's the state, it's the state's responsibility. If it's a city, it's the city's responsibility. Because ultimately, I think we need to get to a point where these heat action plans actually mean something,
Yeah.
which means the organization that is implementing it should ultimately be held accountable for it. And then higher up, there are obviously things that go higher up the chain of government. So, for example, how the Met Department works, and how heatwave alerts are disseminated across the country. So there are important technical bits of the heat policy problem that where the research comes and is effective for local implementing institutions from big national institutions, for example. So that's part of that research ecosystem point. The way Indian academia is structured is a lot of the capacity sits within national institutions, right? So are they able to handle demand for information on heat from several local governments and local NGOs simultaneously? So these are important bits of the system that aren't really covered in a heat action plan, but need to be thought of. And so each of these institutions has a role to play. The National Disaster Management Authority in setting frameworks and guidelines and standards for heat action plans. So it is a difficult question when you ask whose responsibility is it ultimately, because it requires so many interlocking pieces to come together to actually have a policy system that's capable of handling significantly worse amounts of heat in the future.
Yeah, I can see that. But then in your research so far, have you ever come across a place or a district or even a state level plan that is doing well, maybe that could be emulated by others in developing their own plans?
Yeah, so actually there are bits and pieces of heat action plans and mitigation that different cities and different states do well at, right? So some places, for example, go as far as to predict what future heat is going to look like and try and align their actions with it. Some are extremely good at public health measures and have a long history, especially after having dealt with the heat wave. In the past, it's killed many people, of thinking about their health systems and gearing it up and optimizing it for heat. And there are some others that are very experimental with the kind of solutions they're prescribing, so cool roofs or building ponds and lakes and so on. So you see this sort of smattering of activity across the country, but I think what is necessary in the next 5 years is for a couple of places to build a sort of comprehensive package that does well across the board of identifying vulnerability, of public communication, of building capacity, of predicting future heat and incorporating it. So all of these things need to happen. And we need sort of this one sort of standout model. And right now, there are different pockets of efficiency and innovation and so on, but we need to start converging it and making that the baseline across the board. That's the task at the moment.
Okay, yeah, I think I'm beginning to get a sense of how this is such an interlinked, not just policy level, but administrative research as well. I think research and innovation, because without that, we're not going to really be able to adapt or sort of the mitigation challenge itself that lies in front of us.
Absolutely.
Are there any solutions that maybe at a local level, as an individual, I can take steps to sort of help those in my community or even myself, for example?
Yeah, this of course is this varies. Right? It's very difficult to say these are the 4 or 5 things that everyone needs to do because, like I said earlier, it depends on how much you're exposed to heat. It depends on where you are, the kind of heat you have. Is it humid heat or is it dry heat? Like, you can break it down to several variables that make it very hard to prescribe. But things that one can do. But I think one of the sanest pieces of advice I've heard in working on the subject is to develop some sort of internal sense of when you're exhausted and to just back away rather than push yourself and to have some element of self-preservation when it is hot. Because I think because all of us or many of us have grown up in hot climates, there's a tendency to normalize it and say that, okay, this is when I'm feeling hot. Of course, I'm feeling hot. I've always felt hot. Right. And the problem is this is a very different type of heat, right? One of my colleagues, Dr. Sachit Balsari, we were writing something together and he wrote this very interesting line. He said, this is not the heat of your grandfather's generation, right? It has changed. This is now a killing heat. And so it's important to develop those ways of pulling back and listening to yourself. There are many cases where even if one has that level of self-awareness, is not pushing oneself, one's unable to pull back for reasons that are beyond your control, right? So, for example, if you're a construction worker, what is your degree of agency in that situation, right? Because at the moment, I'm not entirely sure. In fact, I'd be very surprised if this very frequent stipulation heat action plans, which is make sure no one's working on construction sites between 12 and 4. I'd be very shocked if this was being implemented across the country because it is a significant drag then on the production of the building, right? Because if you have an entire season where you have only half the working hours or half the daylight hours. And so I think it's important when that is happening, where it's clear that people who aren't able to exert themselves in terms of their speech and agency and make sure that they're protected. I think it's very important for civil society and local governments and so on to sort of get involved and make sure that there is some protection there, because not everyone can adapt to heat, because social inequality is a pretty big determinant of whether you can adapt to heat, right? If you're historically voiceless or are earning a daily wage and do not have enough money under the mattress to deal with 2 days of not having an income, then you're less likely to say, hey, I'm not working between 12 and 4. So those are the things that you kind of have to start looking out for to make sure that we're building systems that allow for compensation between 12 and 4, for example.
To be able to identify and sort of raise voice for those.
Exactly.
That's true for not just heat. I think all of climate impact revolves around this central discussion, right, of the inequality, because climate change affects all of us differently, just the way you said heat does as well. And I always wonder from India's point of view, right? Most of our life happens in public spaces. There are so many people working out there on a daily basis, street vendors, construction workers, like you pointed out. Nowadays, there's this new issue of the gig economy workers who are constantly out there shuttling between orders and stuff. Yeah, and moreover, from my own personal experience, I think, so I live in Pune, and over here we are, I don't know, we're probably catching up on the infrastructural activities for the last 20 years in the last 2 years or so. So there's construction happening all around, not just residential, but even like large scale metro projects and other road widening things. So there's this catch-22 situation where things are getting hotter. So I'm putting on more air conditioners and sort of using more energy to cool buildings. Also, I don't know what the fascination is with glass buildings for commercial complexes,
Yeah.
which probably
Yeah.
isn't the greatest idea for a country like India. So you use
Yeah.
more energy to cool these buildings, leading to what you earlier said about the urban heat effect.
Key time. Yeah.
So what is the situation out of this? Um, how do we avoid the urban development issues along with the
Yeah.
obviously foreseen um, impact of heat?
Yeah. It's it's a tricky question. It is a I don't think there is a straightforward answer, right? There are two views on this. One view is a bit of a laissez-faire kind of market-driven approach, which is the best way to deal with all of these climate impacts is just make sure people get rich quickly. Make sure incomes rise and they're able to adapt in ways that are suitable to them and they deal with their own threats. And the best level of decision making is at the personal level. It's not community, it's not district, it's state. That's how adaptation should happen. And the argument goes, look to the West because they are much better off with adaptation. Because they have high levels of disposable income that they can commit to personal adaptation. Right? That is one argument. Now, the problem with that argument is it sort of abstracts away the fact that growth always comes with persistent inequality, right? At least to begin with. So the spoils of growth aren't usually evenly distributed. There are very few countries that are able to build political systems and social systems that are able to do that. And so that argument kind of fails because if you have people then that don't have the same amount of coping capacity, aren't able to access information in the same way about what the hazards are, what the solutions are, and so on. And indeed aren't able to raise voice in situations of danger, like we were just discussing. That sort of the sort of libertarian, individual-led approach to the problem is less likely to succeed, right? Then you have the second argument, which is a more state-led approach, a more welfarist approach, which is to say, okay, what we do need, we are going to have frequent shocks to the system, heat, flooding, so on and so forth. And these frequent shocks demand compensatory mechanisms that ensure some sort of social and economic stability, right? So think of insurance mechanisms with large enough pools so it's easy to buy the insurance scheme through a premium that is set up for climate-related hazards or some extension general insurance system that we have at the moment. Um, think about programs like Manrega, think about the whole ambit of social policy we have in this country as being adaptation measures, right? Which is it creates enough slack in the system that if you have shocks, people are more likely to be able to absorb it, right? So all of these things need redesign and rethinking, but it's the general idea that if you have a system where you can compensate for occasional shocks, that can help. And the second part of this argument is the state needs to get much stronger and better at dealing with this stuff, right? Because it's very good at building highways and establishing broadband networks and infrastructural tasks. But when it comes to dealing with uncertainty and hyperlocal problems, which is what climate change does, right? It's not clear when it's going to happen. It's not entirely clear which neighborhood it's going to be. It's not clear what the intensity is going to be. How much bigger should the dams be if dams are adaptation solution? What kind of crops do we need? There's so much uncertainty, and there's a risk of bad bets being made, of course, but also there's a challenge of understanding what needs to be done. And so state capacity needs to increase. State capacity needs to increase. And you're talking about panchayats in states that traditionally haven't had strong third tiers of government. You're talking about cities that are just becoming the towns that are just turning into cities and don't have settled systems of governance just yet. If it requires training within and capacity building within these systems, including the provision of finance. So they have to figure out a way of financing all of this, which is a big problem. But then it also requires support from the outside, right? So then it requires civil society support, because ways of interpreting the problem and understanding how people are reacting to these things, these sort of deeply rooted insights, can only come when you have people actually embedded in those environments, not within the state, but outside the state, right? So then that makes climate change makes actually the most convincing argument for an active and thriving civil society system, which can both help in the research side and understanding things, but also implementation and the state's eyes and ears on the ground. So there has to be that sort of close collaboration, right? That's the sort of second macro view of this, which is far more involved, right? It requires the capacity building, the financing, thinking about civil society ecosystems, thinking about whether vulnerable people are being heard. And so there are two very big divergent paths, right? And it is a question that needs to be answered fairly quickly. Like, what do we have a strategy for this? Which path are we do we want to go down? And both of them have major risks and errors, right? So neither one's perfect. Because this is such an involved and complicated process. The second one is like building that sort of state capacity, improving coordination between levels, that you might end up squandering some very precious years on things that aren't effective, because you have thousands of governments in this country. It's not just one, right? Because each of these organizations operates separately. If you add up all the districts and the panchayats and the cities and the states. So yeah, it's a conversation that needs to begin, but it needs to begin now.
Is that happening though? I'm wondering if we are already doing something where all these different stakeholders come together, have discussions, sort of bring out key takeaways for each year's heat action plans. Is that happening? Is that something
Yes.
we can work toward?
That happens. So specifically on heat action. So all my points before this were about climate adaptation as a whole, right? In the sense that I think it's very difficult to go down each climate hazard and then build a bespoke like governance response and a systemic response, because it's just too much replication of like capacity and policy and thinking. You need to sort of have something that is all encompassing, right? But that's just sort of a clarification about the previous thing. On heat specifically, the National Disaster Management Authority every year in February puts together a workshop that brings together all the state disaster managers. And they have a series of workshop style sessions where states and districts come and present their experiences, and there's a lot of learning and cross-pollination. This year's workshop, for example, even had sectoral representation, right? So people from the railways and the army sort of came and talked about the mitigation measures. And sorry, the in heat universe, mitigation means preparedness, but climate policy would also think of mitigation as reducing carbon emissions. But heat preparedness measures in all of these sectors, like the railways and army and so on. There's a lot happening across the system.
Okay, that gives me some hope and heart. But there's a but that I'm sensing here, so I'll let you finish.
Well, the but is very simply about the scale of the problem and the quickness with which it's descending upon us, right? It's encouraging to see policies and innovation that are so widespread and look so interesting. But we aren't very far away from the sort of heat waves that will be truly, truly, truly damaging. And I think I think there's enough consensus to say, both within government and outside government, amongst policy watchers, amongst the people predicting what the climate is going to look like, that India is going to have some very serious heat waves in the future. So the question is, are we doing enough quickly enough? And it is a huge challenge. It is an absolutely massive challenge, right? And it requires a very quick and immediate response. And like I said, it's not just about dealing with present day heat, it's actually thinking about future heat, because a lot of these measures will take 10, 15, 20 years to kick in. Like a tree takes 20 years to kick in, and if that's what's giving you shade in a very densely populated area, then you should plant it now, but you should have a strategy for what you're planting, where you're planting, and why. So, yeah, that was the but. Yeah.
Makes sense. Then in that case, there is this long-term problem, but we're also battling with the immediate short-term issues like this year's summer. So how can policymakers strike a balance between the short-term emergency responses, the measures that have to be taken versus these long-term sustainable sort of climate change adaptation strategies itself?
Yeah.
I know it's a broad question again because there's no specific answer, but do you, in your years of experience, think there's this sort of tug of war happening between short-term and long-term adaptation?
Well, there's a tug of war to the extent that short-term measures are more immediate and satisfying to implement, and have the appearance of things being done and save lives immediately, right? So when the goal is zero heat wave deaths, so you end up thinking about short-term measures for the present year. But if that goal continues into the future, to keep meeting that goal, you need to have invested enough in long-term measures, right? Because at some point, short-term measures aren't going to be enough to deal with things unless there's some big change in innovation, and like everyone has some sort of personalized cooling technology that takes no energy or something. That may be something that changes the game, but given what we have right now, at some point, the number of deaths and the risk is going to surpass the ability of short-term measures to deal with those risks. And so there has to be an almost immediate allocation of resources to long-term thinking and long-term measures, because the climate is warming and there is no question about it. And we are going to get to about 1.5 degrees somewhere in the 2030s. There's 1.5 degrees of warming from the pre-industrial average. And then we're going to get to 2 degrees sometime in the 50s or early 60s. So there's not a lot of time. I mean, the mid to late 2030s is a decade away, right? So clearly the investment has to begin right away. Now, the problem is those investments are going to look kind of funny because it's planting some trees by the side of the street rather than erecting a cooling center, which looks and feels like you're doing something about the problem. And indeed, climate adaptation across the board has this issue, because things that are visible and tangible are preferred over these softer solutions that actually might be more useful in the long run, right? So exactly. So, I remember looking at seawalls, and I was talking to someone about seawalls. I was doing some field work around it. And I always remember what he said. He said, listen, it's big, it's gray, it's solid, it's in front of my house. And it is greatly reassuring to me that it exists, right? And I really, really like the fact that there's a seawall here. And indeed, like for the foreseeable future, 2 or 3 years, it would have worked. But the way seawalls work, they eventually end up falling down, carving, and you get the damage you're going to get, and sometimes it's even more sudden, right? To the extent that the IPCC calls some types of seawalls in certain circumstances maladaptation.
Yeah, they're more dangerous in the end when it breaks. And
exactly. And so similarly with heat, right? You might end up doing things that are immediately visible. And so, the provision of ORS and sachets and so on, and fountains, for example, which is something they do in the West a lot. So these things are all sort of, it looks like there is a response to it. But when you're sitting and noodling around with building bylaws, and you're basically telling people, well, you can't have this building that you think looks great, but you need to have all of these other elements of energy efficiency and some element of passive cooling. It can't be heat trapping and so on and so forth. You start putting all these restrictions through legal methods. Or indeed, you're just sort of like planting trees somewhere. None of these things are exciting in the same ways. So there is that sort of challenge between the long term, the short term. The short term stuff is always an adaptation, more politically salient and more visible. So that's a challenge.
I think I'd like to sort of summarize all the discussion now. And a couple of things that are coming to my mind, at least, are I guess at an individual level, right? Because I cannot speak for the government, neither can I speak for a larger group of people. But I'd like this podcast to constantly refer to what I can do as an individual. So in terms of heat waves, I think what I'm hearing from you is one, try and find localized solutions where something that is for your area, for where you live, for your community, makes sense at that point. But then rather than doing some maladaptive practices, is there something I can refer to as an individual this year if I want to step up and do my bit for the community? Where do I turn to? What is there? Are there any resources? Are there any places I can actually find what works for me in my neighborhood?
Yeah. I think the best thing to do is actually to engage with whatever planning process exists for the heat action plan, right? Like, I think at some level, people who are concerned about this as a problem should be going um, um, and to their local government officials and just asking about them, because at the moment, that's not how this policy works, right? This isn't a matter of great public concern at the moment. This is coming through the sort of technocratic conduit.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it is a great thing that so many governments across this country have recognized heat as a problem and are thinking about heat action plans. But I think it's all the better if there's some level of localized concern that is projected into the policy making process, right? And that's true of many things. It's true of environmental pollution. For example, if you think about air pollution, it's much more likely solutions get implemented if people actually are saying that this is a major concern for me. That's probably the first and most important thing, right? Actually, like sort of solidifying the policy edifice and sort of making sure the foundations are good in your local community is probably the best way of handling this problem long term, right? Each place needs to build a history and a legacy of having dealt with this problem. That's what localization means. Every place needs a story of dealing with this problem, and that requires people to be involved in that story, right? So that's probably the first thing. But I think at the individual level, and especially if you're the sort of person that's responsible for other people in some way, for example, if you have a family and people who are dependent on you in some way, whether they're old or young, or if you're employing people, that brings a certain set of responsibilities in terms of making sure that you're not exposing people that you have some responsibility for to heat, right? And that's a very crucial thing, and that spreads not only from that accrues not only to just individuals, but also people who own businesses and employers of various sorts. And so in effect, you could actually, I think, end up covering like 50% of the population, trying sort of exposing them less to heat if you hit the sort of 5% of the population that sort of makes decisions that impact these people, right? And I think it's very important to communicate why this is an important issue, heat and just climate stresses in general will have the sort of, and I want to keep saying that, if you do want something for heat, it's probably fungible and can be used for a whole bunch of protective measures across climate hazard. But it is extremely important to build that sort of local awareness, right? I want to say this, we are at a very early stage in understanding this problem and reacting to the problem. And this is the beginning of our heat response, right? Over the next couple of decades, this story is going to get much, much denser. It's going to get much more complicated. And so it's important to think of this as us being on the starting blocks in some way. Though we have had many years of response behind us, we have had many big heat waves, I think it's becoming clear now from a scientific perspective that what we're dealing with is a very, very, very different normal. And just because the modeling has gotten more precise and we have a better understanding of what heat waves might look like in the future. So all of these things about the nuts and bolts of engaging with these processes or making sure that you're looking out for other people, right? It's important to see that as the beginning of something rather than the end point of something, right? It will evolve over time, all of these things.
And the more we learn about it, the better response probably is as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I think we are also quite over our time limit, but it was such a nice discussion. I would, though, like to conclude with a little bit of a hopeful sort of not a message, but more of a hopeful leeway or a segue, and let you talk about the upcoming organization that you're sort of building, because that might be the building block towards a lot of further issues, right?
Right.
So,
right.
I think there's a lot of work being done on that, and I really would like to see that as the silver lining towards the issues that we're going to soon deal with.
Right. Thank you. I mean, that's very nice of you. So, yeah, the last couple of months, my colleagues and I have been trying to think of an organization that is capable of helping deal with some of these things that we see coming down the pike. So, it is appropriately called Sustainable Futures Collaborative. And the idea is to think about all the different things that are central to India's future, right? And think about ways of crafting responses today that can have big downstream impacts over time across sectors. So what are the key sort of strategic points and policy nodes that you need to tackle? And what are the things you need to think about, the levers you need to pull that can bring about some sort of systemic change in the area of resilience, for example, but equally in sort of making sure India's carbon emissions are sustainable over time. How do we think about being competitive with green technologies? How do we think about reforming the electricity sector? And how do we deal with several hugely important, historically under-addressed issues such as air pollution, various types of environmental pollution, pollution regulation in general, right? So these are the sort of big macro questions that we think about. But like I said, it's we see ourselves as an organization that is one in a network and an ecosystem of organizations, which is why it's called Sustainable Futures Collaborative, because we've understood, I think, full well that these solutions can only be implemented through some sort of coordinated effort, not just between organizations such as ourselves, but also between ourselves and governments at different levels. So a lot of our work now is done in collaboration with other organizations. And so we work with researchers across the world. So for example, we're working with climate modelers now to predict where future heat is going to be the worst. And we're trying to understand what the implementation roadblocks are to all of those long-term solutions I was talking to you about, right? What exactly is preventing long-term solutions from being implemented? Is it awareness? Is it the fact that there isn't enough money in the system? Is it the fact that people don't really know what to implement, even if they have awareness and money? Right? We don't actually specifically know the policy problem at hand here, right? So we want to just have some degree of precision about this so we can actually diagnose the problem before solving it, before it's too late and we're at a 1.5 degree world. We really need to fix this now. So we have those sort of collaborative networks across disciplines. So it's climate modelers with policy researchers. And so we're trying to do interesting stuff in that sense, sort of like bringing together worlds of knowledge, because we see this as sort of a big and comprehensive problem. And indeed, we work a lot with governments too and talk to them about what we see the best solution as for a particular solution, or at least how to think about things, even if we don't have the answers. So we work with institutions in the national government, we're in conversations with state governments. And so that's a very big part, apart from research, of our work, of making sure that implementation happens. And now, because I think we're fully convinced that this is a problem that needs to be addressed very quickly.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing all this expertise and the knowledge and simplifying it, because I think that is the hardest task, to let anyone be interested in the topic to actually feel like it's accessible. Yeah, for all those who are interested to know more about this, about heat waves or anything related to it, do go check out Aditya's work. There was a report that was released last year, very interesting, also very accessible, with a lot of graphs and things to let you sort of visualize the issues in the Indian context. Yeah, for more details, reach out and we can also put in some links here in the description.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I hope it was useful to your listeners.
Thank you for watching this episode. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We're also available on other social media. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. See you around for the next episodes.